So welcome back from the lunch hour. I'm Bob Stout. I'll be emceeing this next afternoon session, and we're going to broaden the aperture now and talk about international policy, regulation, and science. So, but before we do that, first of all, I want to introduce myself and say what an honor and frankly how humbling it is to be part of this program at UT and MDel with such eminent scientists, a number of whom you've heard from already, and who are not only that, but incredible collaborators and communicators, and also have shown remarkable patience as I, a guy with only a Juris Doctor, which doesn't count, ask all of these technical questions and try to understand and have to have things explained to me 3 or 4 times. So I think as we've already seen this morning, this is a wonderful combination, bringing together people with deep technical expertise, as well as those who are operating in markets and policy. But before we get too serious, this is a very serious thing we're doing here. For all the reasons we've talked about. But I also think it's really important, and especially in the post-lunch hour, where energy can flag a little bit, that we do what Aaron says and continue with this as an unconference, and that we have a little fun activity. So I'm going to ask you all to stand, please. Yes, and that includes Dave. So my view is every important initiative not only needs a theme, but also needs a theme song. So I put my mind to that, and I decided a really good theme song as well as activity to get us going, something we could act out, would be a song to the tune of the Village People's YMCA, only it's EEMDL. And I'm going to ask you to help me. I'm going to sing some very topical lyrics, maybe too topical. And then when we come to the refrain, I'm going to ask my assistants here in this case, with you joining them, to do EEMDL. Okay? I can barely do it myself. And whoever does it best, you get a whole bunch of MDel bucks. All right, are we ready? Methane may just be natural gas if it's leaking. The world will take a pass, but to manage, we must measure it first. We are here to help quench that thirst. To do that, we need models and tools. They must scale for supply chains and megajoules. Inventories must be measured in foreign policies, and markets transform. Bum, 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 bum. That's why we formed the EMDL. Come join us, EMDL. We've got minds in UT, along with CSU, making usable tools for you. EMDL, collaborate with the EMDL. We need each one of you, business, government too, to help us make net zero true. Thank you, thank you. And I promise my panelists, who can now join me, that the singing is over. We warned you it was an unconference. So our first panel of the afternoon, we're really privileged to have some great speakers on the topic of, we've called accelerating global action on methane mitigation of fossil energy. We have 2 senior people from the US government, one who is going to join us virtually, and that's Claire Wang from the Department of State. We'll cue her up in a moment. She's the senior policy advisor to John Kerry, who of course is the special presidential envoy for climate. We have Tom Curry from the Department of Energy. He is the Director of Policy and Analysis in the Office of Resource Sustainability And then we have the inimitable Dr. Aaron Tullis, a good friend and colleague who, as you can see, we've done a bit of coordination here for the day in our clothing. But I've known Aaron for a long time, and she's one of the most generous, thoughtful, and kind of technically deep as well as operationally and commercially deep people I know. And she's a senior research fellow for MDel and the University of Texas at Austin. And so what we're going to do, the way we're going to run this one is we have presentations essentially by each of our three panelists. We'll start with Craig, then over to Tom, and over to Aaron. And they're going to cover individual topics that kind of frame this important general topic. And then, as before, and we've allowed a lot of time for this, so save up your questions, we're going to have a question and answer period. So I encourage people in the room, as well as those of you online, to please get your questions in, because we'll have plenty of time for that and interaction as well. So let's start off with, can you cue up Claire Wang?
She's behind me.
Oh, there you are. Hi, Claire. Good to
Hello. I've been behind you this whole time.
You're right behind me. Welcome, and over to you.
Wonderful. And can you confirm if you can hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. I'll do my best to speak, even though I was rendered speechless by that brilliant song and dance that went on. I wish I was there to join you all in the room, but really appreciate the opportunity to chat with everybody virtually. As mentioned, my name is Claire Wang. I'm a senior advisor here in the Office of Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, at the U.S. Department of State. Our office leads President Biden's international climate agenda and oversees engagement on all things methane, as well as broader in the energy sector and other critical emissions reductions and climate adaptation priorities. As everybody knows, in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, many of which we are already experiencing this year in particular, it is critical that we accelerate efforts to decarbonize the energy sector and to address all greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane, where there are particular solutions coming from fossil energy that we must deploy today. Importantly, natural gas use must fall in half by 2050 from 2019 levels in median scenarios to limit warming to 1.5°C. This means we're transitioning to zero emission sources of energy, especially renewables, as swiftly as possible, ending new sources of natural gas demand and shifting existing sources of demand towards these clean energy resources. But of course, decarbonization alone, even among the most aggressive fossil fuel phase down scenarios, will not cut our overall methane emissions and GHG emissions quickly enough. It is essential that we complement the global energy sector transition with immediate actions to cut methane emissions from fossil energy and reduce the methane intensity of our production and use as part of the energy transition. There's actually a new report that just came out this morning from the International Energy Agency and the UN Environment's Program Climate and Clean Air Coalition that lays out this point quite clearly. And so I definitely encourage you to take a look at that over the course of the day. There is no faster strategy to limit warming in the near term than to tackle methane emissions. Everybody here knows methane is 86 times as potent as CO2 and only lasts about 12 years in the atmosphere. So if we're serious about tackling methane emissions in just the 7 short years before the end of this decade, we can actually see global temperatures come down by mid-century, a timeline that is relevant for all of our lives, business models, policymaking trajectories, and whatnot. And this is essential to reduce the risk of crossing dangerous climate tipping points and avoid the risk of overshoot of 1.5°C. At COP26 in Glasgow, the United States and the EU launched the Global Methane Pledge, a collective commitment to reduce global anthropogenic methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030 from 2020 levels. Over 150 countries have now joined the pledge, including 12 of the 20 largest emitters of methane in the world. And in the short 7 years to 2030, we must now accelerate implementation of methane reduction projects and strengthen policies to first stop the record year-on-year growth rate of methane emissions, and then bend that curve to see deep reductions. Our engagements on methane here at the SPEC team, as we call ourselves, cover all sectors, agriculture, waste, and energy. But the oil and gas sector in particular must play a leading role in achieving the deepest reductions. In fact, the fossil energy sector has to deliver over half of methane emissions required to meet the global methane pledge by 2030, because this sector has the greatest share of cost-effective and technically feasible methane mitigation potential. The IEA estimates that over 70% of methane emissions can be cut in the oil and gas sector at low cost, and nearly half of emissions can be avoided at no cost. Achieving this full methane mitigation potential in the oil and gas sector alone would eliminate 0.1 degrees Celsius in warming by mid-century, which is just enormous when we're talking about a 1.5 degrees C temperature rise. The temperature equivalent of this would be if we immediately eliminated the emissions of every car and every truck in the world. So it is very much on par with our most aggressive climate and energy decarbonization solutions in other sectors too. And importantly, cutting methane is not just a climate solution. It's also a critical energy security solution, a health solution, and a development solution. Every year, 260 billion cubic meters of gas are wasted in the oil and gas sector due to flaring, venting, and leakage. If this gas were captured, it would be the third largest gas producer in the world. It is a critical solution we have to improving energy access, as we've seen in key countries like Nigeria, Angola, and others. It's also a major source of local air pollution, whether from black carbon emissions from flaring or the creation of ground level ozone, which contributes to hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations and premature deaths every year. To address the full suite of methane emissions reductions opportunities from fossil energy, President Biden launched the Global Methane Pledge Energy Pathway at the Major Economies Forum in June 2022. Since then, and since the launch of the Global Methane Pledge, we've seen major implementation progress happening around the world to tackle methane emissions from this critical sector. The United States, EU, Canada, and Australia are all this year in the process of finalizing strengthened regulations to cut methane emissions in our oil and gas sectors. Last year, Colombia and Nigeria became the first countries in South America and Africa, respectively, to develop methane regulations in oil and gas. And this year, as we head into COP28, hosted, of course, by the UAE, with significant attention on how the oil and gas sector is going to reduce emissions in line with limiting warming to 1.5 C, we hope and expect that additional countries will step up to announce their plans to regulate methane emissions and take on additional substantial implementation steps to cut these emissions and deploy this lowest of the low-hanging fruit. More relevant for this conversation as well, there is substantial activity that's being taken by major importers of oil, gas, and coal, recognizing the profound purchasing power that major consumers have in encouraging emissions reductions and emissions transparency across the oil, gas, and coal value chains. At COP27, the US, EU, Japan, Canada, Norway, Singapore, and the United Kingdom released a joint declaration from energy importers and exporters on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. This commits these countries to work together towards the creation of an international market for fossil fuels that minimizes methane and CO2 emissions from fossil production to the greatest extent possible. And the countries that are covered under this joint declaration cover over half of global gas import volumes and over 1/3 of global gas production, illustrating the global and growing consensus on the need to tackle this key topic. Earlier this year, there was further implementation progress here, with Japan, Korea, Australia, the US, and the EU delivering a joint statement on cutting methane from LNG this July that was led primarily by Japan and other Pacific markets, and also included new voluntary industry efforts to call for emissions transparency and accuracy in order to allow consumers to purchase lower methane and lower emissions LNG. And of course, we, as I imagine you all have as well, been tracking with great interest the European Union's draft methane regulations, which is an enormous opportunity for the EU as a major fossil energy importing geography to strengthen policies to measure and mitigate methane emissions from their fossil consumption, which is by far the most influential way that the EU can cut methane beyond their more limited domestic production. One last thing I want to highlight is that the US, the EU, and others are also supporting the creation of new systems to leverage satellite data to accelerate methane mitigation, including through the International Methane Emissions Observatory's Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS, which will speed up the detection, attribution, and hopefully the mitigation of major satellite-detected super emitter events. The MARS system was launched in pilot form at COP27 last year. It is already up and running, issuing detections and supporting emissions reductions around the world. So it's clear that methane is becoming a no-excuse climate, energy security, health, and development opportunity. It's critical, especially this year, to see industry step up to meet the moment, to see buyers leveraging their purchasing power to disseminate reductions across the sector, and to see investors incorporating methane reduction considerations in their ongoing and new investments, as well as to actively support the methane reduction projects that we so desperately need to see today. Here in the United States, we are mobilizing resources across the federal government to address both international and domestic methane mitigation, from EPA to DOE, as Tom will speak to our Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration at the Department of Transportation, as well as the State Department Energy Resources Bureau. Our investment agencies are also eager to support development and investment in methane reduction projects, including through EXIM, USTDA, and our Development Finance Corporation, formerly OPIC. So this really is an all of the above opportunity for us to mobilize the full force of the United States federal government and also all of the relevant players in this ecosystem to tackle this clear climate solution. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Claire. That was fantastic and reminding us of what we started with today, and that is our important goals globally and in the U.S. And then the importance of the work we're doing here to help achieve them. And as you said, all of the above from a climate change and energy security as well as health standpoint, it's so important. So thank you for that really, really great review and comments. And now we'll turn it over to Tom Curry from the Department of Energy.
Great, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Claire. It's always great to be joined by you, even virtually. So I've got some slides. So good afternoon. My name is Tom Curry. I'm the Director of Policy and Analysis in the Office of Resource Sustainability, which is part of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at DOE. The Office of Resource Sustainability has a number of functions that are relevant to the conversations here today and tomorrow. My colleague Tim Reinhardt, who's here, is the Director of the Division of Methane Mitigation Technologies. Tim and his team lead DOE's RD&D efforts around methane detection, quantification, and mitigation technologies, including projects that the MDIL team and many of you here in the audience are participating in. We also, within our office, have a regulatory role with regards to the import and export of natural gas to and from the United States. And under the Natural Gas Act, DOE reviews applications for the export of natural gas to non-free trade agreement countries and makes public interest determinations about those applications. Our office also supports research on critical minerals and fossil resource sustainability, and we support DOE engagement domestically and internationally on issues related to fossil fuels. You'll hear more about our office and the broader efforts of DOE's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Tomorrow morning, our Assistant Secretary, Brad Crabtree, will be giving the keynote, and you'll have an opportunity to learn more from Assistant Secretary Crabtree about the initiative that I'm going to review today and has already been referred to during the morning discussions. And that's about the development of an international framework for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions from the natural gas supply chain. So I'm going to try not to steal Brad's thunder. So we recognize, and I think Dr. Allen presented this morning, there's considerable activities and there's considerable progress being made related to the MMRV of methane and carbon dioxide associated with delivered gas. However, as we've had meetings in DC and meetings with stakeholders throughout the country, we've heard consistently that there's no consensus regarding expectations for a company that's making a claim about the greenhouse gas intensity of delivered or contracted gas. In response to this feedback and need, we're working with international partners to develop a shared and broadly credible global framework for estimating greenhouse gas emissions across the international supply chain for natural gas. Before I get into some of the details of the work that we're doing, I want to emphasize a few important points about what the initiative is and what it is not. As part of this initiative, DOE is not introducing a regulatory or performance-based standard for clean natural gas, nor is DOE looking to start certifying natural gas in the marketplace. We are working with other countries on an international framework for the MMRV of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the global natural gas supply chain that can be used by both buyers and sellers or individual governments. Echoing the comments that Claire made, I think Claire provided a great overview of the sort of overarching efforts of the administration, of which this is a slice. These efforts align with the Biden administration's U.S. methane emission reduction action plan and pledged the U.S. will work with global partners to reduce the world's methane emissions, including through the joint declaration and other announcements that Claire referred to. This last point is critical. We see advancing a credible framework as a fundamental to catalyzing voluntary markets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the natural gas supply chain globally. As we heard this morning from the industry panel, buyers are currently focused on the geographic source of natural gas and the price of that natural gas, but there's a need and an interest in moving to trusted data on the greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And this framework intends to try to advance that consistency. So I'm going to start with a couple of slides on process and then move into more of the substance. So in May of this year, DOE began engaging and collaborating with representatives from importing and exporting countries, importing and exporting governments and regions. It's not all countries. We also have the European Commission and the East Mediterranean Gas Forum participating. But this working group that we've formed is supported by 4 distinct groups of participants. We have the working group, which is composed of government principals who are making decisions about the direction and areas of focus for the technical group. We have a technical group that's made up of participating government technical staff that makes recommendations to the working group and identifies areas where consensus hasn't been reached. This technical group solicits feedback from a group of what we call the stakeholder representative group, which is made up of experts nominated by participating governments to ensure that the technical group has the benefit of input from a diverse group of stakeholders with global perspectives and technical expertise. This group is intended to provide feedback to the international working group. And then as part of the working group, each participating country has also been encouraged to engage with domestic stakeholders. And I guess this is the critical point for this audience. DOE really values and appreciates the input that we've gotten from a number of different stakeholders, again, many of whom are in the room or online today. And it's a critical part of this initiative to have this kind of dialogue and opportunity. And so I hope, if we haven't talked to you directly, I hope you'll take this as an invitation to provide feedback to DOE as we're moving through this process. We want to ensure a robust and practical framework for MMRV. Again, I'll get to more substance in a moment, but just trying to set the stage with some of the work that we're doing here. This is a list of the participating countries and regions that are part of the MMRV working group. The agencies and departments listed here have principals and staff that are participating in the technical group and the working group that I just described. And as noted at the bottom of this slide, the inclusion on this list is really about participating in the working group and not a commitment to endorse or use the framework or other work products of this initiative. So with that as kind of an overview and setup of really process, and now I want to move to the substance, hopefully setting up further discussions about the substance by Aaron. So I guess a couple of things here just to provide an overview. As I think I've already said, we're looking to identify key elements of an MMRV framework for greenhouse gas emissions across the international supply chain. And we're striving to enable comparable and reliable information on methane, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gas emissions to provide market participants with verified information about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, volumes, and intensity from production all the way through to delivery. We recognize there's a lot of important work out there, including the OGMP 2.0 and other reporting approaches. And the goal here is to try to leverage the best of those approaches, recognizing that none of them were created specifically for the purposes that we've defined here. The products and tools that might be developed throughout this process are intended for voluntary markets and for voluntary use. And there's not a commitment by the participating governments to engage or to incorporate them into any sort of regulatory program. As I said earlier, this is not establishing a specific greenhouse gas intensity standard or level. And I've read this slide a million times. And yeah, and we're not focusing on economics. Sorry about that. I didn't include that in my notes. I thought I'd be able to see the slide. So moving again further into the substance here. So we've identified 4 potential elements of an MMRV framework: verification or certification criteria, data transparency and dissemination tools, accreditation and certification. Accreditation and coordination. The first 3 of those are really the focus of the international working group. The 4th element around coordination is something that we see as important. There's ongoing coordination of the framework, but we've tabled that discussion for a later date after the other elements of the framework are better defined. Another thing that I want to emphasize: we're not at the beginning of a process, but we're not at the end of a process either. And so while I'm going to go through the pieces of this and some of the underlying points of what we're discussing, it really is a work in progress, and we'd welcome feedback on any and all of the aspects that I'm going to highlight here regarding the framework. So starting with certification or verification criteria. So an overall principle of the MMRV framework working group is to build on the significant body of existing work in this space. The working group is looking to review and build upon existing protocols and standards to establish a consistent set of technical criteria for reporting emissions and operating data, and developing common requirements that an independent certifier would use to assess greenhouse gas emissions intensity, accuracy, representativeness, and completeness. And when we're looking at this, we're thinking both about emissions and operating data that might be used to calculate or to estimate emissions associated with a particular asset or particular site, but then also an aggregated life cycle supply chain result. And so we think about both the technical criteria for certification and technical criteria around emissions. We're thinking about it both as, I guess, as we talked about it internally, there's puzzle pieces and then there's a puzzle. And so trying to think about how do you create, again, comparable, accurate, reliable data in both of those spheres. On data and tools, through this framework, we're looking to establish expectations for collecting and reporting data consistent with the needs of natural gas market participants and others. As a part of the process, we're exploring approaches that value measured data over modeled data or emission factor-based data. We're also exploring the development of tools and approaches to ensure consistency and transparency in the reporting of data and the aggregation of data across the natural gas supply chain. And finally, we're exploring approaches to evaluating the quality of data through the development of a data quality metric that indicates data reliability and representativeness. And so I think some of the earlier panels talked about trying to represent uncertainty or understanding what uncertainty is associated with emissions estimates. And we see this idea of introducing some metric or indicator related to data quality as reflecting that uncertainty and providing useful information for market participants. The next element is around accreditation. And through our work on this framework, we're reviewing existing approaches to accreditation to identify potential models that we can build on as appropriate. The goal is to have an approach that confirms that certifiers are independent, technically qualified, and verify information in accordance with the framework. We're also exploring mechanisms for reviewing accreditation over time to ensure continued adherence to the criteria. Before concluding this part of the presentation, I wanted to provide some information about how you all can provide feedback to DOE. We've launched a website that's at the link here. I can email it to you if you want to look at it. If you look up FECM, Office of Resource Sustainability, you should be able to find the link. We have the slides that I've presented here are part of a public presentation that we made a couple of weeks ago, and they're available on the website. We're also going to be posting updates on that website, and there's an email address that you can see here on the slide, FE-30 correspondence@hq.doe.gov, and you can use that to send us feedback. And again, we'd welcome continued feedback and welcome the interest. And I look forward to the discussion, but I guess I'll turn it back to Bob.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm quickly going to turn it over to Aaron in a moment. But first of all, thanks for that presentation, the depth at which you've done this work, and I'm sure, like myself, we're all hearing so many points of kind of alignment and similarity between what we heard this morning and the work that you guys are taking forward. So, Dr. Tullis, over to you.
Thank you. All right, thanks so much. Such a joy to be up here with you guys talking about this. So I wanted to start with a few opening principles and say only actual emissions count. And what I mean by that is, I'll start with a story. About 7 years ago, I transitioned out of my first science love, which was ozone formation chemistry, and moved into methane. And as I began to work within the industry context within a company, I asked the business, within this research portfolio, would you like me to work on reducing actual emissions or paper emissions? Because they're not going to be the same sources. And I think what has probably inspired the next 7 years and up through now was the answer that I got was, well, actual emissions, because only actual emissions count, but we sure would like credit for them. And there, to me, is where we have set up this dichotomy that sometimes becomes really problematic, because we ostensibly want to reward reductions in methane, either through market mechanisms or other means, but then we calculate emissions that don't reward the reduction of actual emissions. And so here we sit. And as we've continued to gain speed as an industry in the progression of a variety of different approaches or theories of change to reduce methane emissions, certification is not necessarily a new concept. And we saw some early models for this emerge that said, hey, the market is really a complicated place. And I loved that Arvind highlighted this morning how complex, considering a global supply chain of oil and gas really is. It's a non-trivial supply chain to map out. And so we saw early participants in this say, we want to go ahead and develop this mechanism, and we're going to use data that we know is imperfect, but we're going to use it as a placeholder and go ahead and build the system around it. And then we saw people continuing to proceed with these kind of suboptimal methane emissions approaches. And so we invested in and developed this massive ecosystem of technology, at least in North America, that's wildly accessible, and started to apply it. And I know two things to be true. One, I've never made a measurement at an oil and gas facility and didn't learn something. So even if the technology isn't perfect, keep using it, because you're still learning, and that learning is still going to be providing information about what you can reduce and emissions you didn't know were there. But I also know that I've never applied a technology and then walked away with a number that I understood and trusted to represent my emissions for the year or the month or maybe even the hour. And so with that as a backdrop, and inspired by the approach DOE and others are taking to say, this is a global problem, and we have to come together and build an ecosystem and build upon what is already underway and good. We wanted to convene as a scientific community and identify, despite varying theories of change on how we can bring about methane reductions, what are the core technical elements we do all agree on. And so Arvind showed you this figure earlier and started to describe this work, and I wanted to just walk through it a little bit in the context of this conversation, because I think at the end of the day, we are successful when we have implemented systems that reduce actual emissions, that we have driven down emissions from the atmosphere and bring about the climate benefits that Claire described a few moments ago. And so we identified 5 particular areas that we need to build out on a consensus basis, ideally across the scientific community, as the tools and the underpinning for things like a global MMRV framework that are very policy oriented and require a different set of thinkers to be ironing out the details for, but need to be grounded in good science still. And so we need to understand how to develop measurement-based estimates. If we know that one number for every flange everywhere in the world isn't good and doesn't help us distinguish between different maintenance practices and different facility designs and the like, then what would be better? And we know that we need to understand how to apply the types of models and tools we've been talking about today. Those models and tools need to exist, and then we need to have the capacity and the broad understanding globally to apply them to bring about an understanding of how to transform those measurements into information, but also how to represent those emissions in the context of a supply chain. We need data quality metrics. And I also appreciated, Tom, when you said that, information to the markets. And so when I think about a data quality metric, I imagine that's really different than when someone in a marketplace is thinking about a data quality metric. They probably, I remember early in my career, people saying, well, what does good look like? And I thought that was kind of a silly question. But then I grew to understand it's because my numbers and my 17 paragraphs of scientific information need to be distilled down to, was it good or is it not good? Is the quality of this data high or is it not high? Do I trust this number or do I not trust this number? So how can we take this preponderance of data and understanding of varying uncertainties, uncertainty associated with the measurement that you make, but also the uncertainty associated with how you apply that measurement to produce an emission rate? Because what we don't have is a set of monitors anywhere that are measuring the flow out of these facilities. And so if we want to take our measurements and turn them into emission rates, and then we want to take those emission rates, Narvin's already told us we can't measure everything all the time, and we want to understand what those observations mean for a longer duration or a broader spatial scale of emissions, we're going to need tools for that, and we're going to need to be able to describe the quality of that synthesized data against some reporting frameworks. Where not all reporting frameworks are equal, but there are going to be some technical underpinnings of them that make them credible. And so what are the technical elements of a reporting framework that make the resultant outputs of those frameworks relevant, credible, and truly differentiating between high emissions and low emissions, irrespective of the policy context that you bring that to? And then finally, I think another thing that people get stuck on sometimes is when we talk about verification, there's an idea in many people's minds that you can simply take a picture of an oil and gas region or a supply chain or a group of facilities and understand the emissions intensity of those facilities, absent any information about the operations that are occurring at the time that that measurement is made. Now, we don't have a perfect answer there, but we still need to be able to somehow, and credibly so, independently verify that we're not missing something significant when we're reporting in from the bottom up. And so there have to be tools that bridge those two perspectives. One that's purely from a third-party perspective and one that's purely from a first-party perspective. And bringing those things together so that both the reporters are using measurements to inform how they're reporting their own emissions, but then also, and this is what I love about the Colorado rules, saying we're going to figure out a way that we're going to bring these two things together. We want a point of view about what we think the emissions intensity of the region is, but we also want to encourage operators to incorporate measurements there. And then finally, at the core of our mission will be to ensure that the capacity and the training and the tools are available for broader public use. And so that's the piece we're trying to support with within this field broadly. From you too. Thanks, Bob. Back to you.
Thank you, Erin. And let's bring Claire Wong back on the screen. And I'm sure you probably already have been inputting questions, but continue doing that while I'm just going to ask an initial one. Running through all of your presentations, running through the comments this morning, is this concept of credibility and trust. And friend of mine who works in this field likes to say you can only move at the speed of trust, and it's very true. I'd be interested, given the breadth of stakeholders that all of you talk to in your positions, including Erin and her work with the UN, and of course the work that Tom and Claire are doing and their agencies are doing. Through those discussions with stakeholders, could you take us into and give us a little bit of color about what you see as some of the main barriers to that trust, and then ways that we can fill that gap? I mean, you've kind of covered the framework, but I'm just interested in the framework of what those conversations are like and what some of those stakeholders are concerned about. And we can start with any one of you that would like to tackle that first.
Claire, we're both staring at you. We both, Tom and.
We're staring at you, Claire.
I am actually happy to hop in first, but could we switch the view of the live stream to show the panelists instead of just the slide? Would love to see your faces.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's a very complicated question because trust comes at all levels, right? Trust comes from the validity and granularity of the technologies used to measure and estimate methane emissions, the differences between top-down and bottom-up estimates. There's a lot of distrust from operators and by operators in terms of the accuracy of the reporting that's coming out of these companies, but also oftentimes these companies' belief in a lot of the newer remote sensing tools that are available. And that's something that we have seen quite frequently, especially in our engagements overseas with other companies and countries that don't really have a legacy of transparent data reporting and may view things like new satellite technologies, for example, as quite scary for them, essentially eyes in the sky that will be able to prove or disprove what they're doing. So a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to trust, especially in terms of measurement, also just translates to trust in terms of what is our intention with this data? Are we trying to name and shame, or are we trying to engage with the purposes of reducing emissions? What is the intention behind action to be taken? Are we simply just stepping back and waiting for the most perfect data possible? Are we really going to use this to reduce emissions where we can see them? And ultimately, it comes to the question of how are we going to put this data into action? And I think that context is going to differ very substantially between operators with high capacity on this topic and operators who are earlier in the learning curve. And so that's why a lot of our engagement overseas in this really focuses on those foundational capacity building aspects to work together with operators and regulators to develop effective methane emissions baselines together, leveraging the best technologies, and be able to ensure that there is confidence all around, not only in terms of where the data is coming from, but also how it's going to be used.
Thank you, Tom. Erin?
Sure, I'll take a shot at some of that. I think a lot of what we've started to do, and I think the motivation for the work within this framework is us hearing from various stakeholders about both, I guess, in some ways, excitement about a lot of the progress that's being made by all of you, by this community in understanding what emissions are and where emissions are, and that that information is frequently different than what we may have thought several years ago. And so there's excitement about the advances in the technology, and there's also excitement about a lot of different initiatives and work that's being done to try to use that information for decision making. But there's sort of a sense that there's too much variety. We're at a point where there's a need for a maturation of the marketplace. Again, thinking about voluntary markets, and so if we can establish more consistency and comparability in the emissions estimates that are being made, again, around this idea that if somebody's delivering natural gas and saying that there's a specific greenhouse gas intensity associated with it, if there's, again, to grow the trust, it's about building confidence in the representativeness of the data, the accuracy of the data, and the comparability of the data. And so trying to advance the marketplace and develop the tools and protocols to really to increase that confidence and comparability.
Thank you. Aaron, did you want to get in on that one?
I don't have a lot to add. So I think you both covered the main points, but I would say that the thing that I hear the most, and I think in this case it's in the context of working with various investors, talking with companies about joining the OGMP, the thing I hear the most is that some sort of consistency, that companies represent their performance and their activities in this broad variety of ways, and it's really difficult to discern for kind of a person that's not deeply immersed in exactly this topic all the time. What is good? What isn't good? What numbers are credible? What aren't? How do the measurements work? How are any of these things the same or different? And so, some consistency and some consolidation in the space, I think, generally would help trust in all angles.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and obviously the consistency has to be grounded in good science, and the science is still developing. And the challenge is having that develop at the speed of policy and markets. Dave, I wonder if there are questions online? I'll bet there are.
From Dr. Lyon. For clarity, at least online out beginning, this is about capacity building, both human capacity building, but then also measurement capability capacity building. And we heard earlier today from Dr. Lyon from the EPA that EPA is looking for 2,000 people with expertise in greenhouse gas emissions along oil and gas supply chains to help implement the provisions of the IRA and other initiatives. What do we do globally? And then we are talking here about how do we integrate ground measurements and drones and aircraft and satellite data. North America is probably the only place that has that challenge right now with that preponderance of data. How do we build global measurement capacity? So capacity building.
Would like to
Thanks so much for the question. Oh, sorry, was someone stepping in there?
Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much for the question. It's definitely a challenge to juggle this many tools to get at the most accurate, but also the most actionable data possible. I'm happy to take a moment to talk through some of the international programs and partnerships that we're engaged with to help build this capacity internationally. One of them includes the International Methane Emissions Observatory at the UN Environment Program, which of course has its own robust efforts to coordinate the global satellite and remote sensing community to integrate data sources from these diverse tools into more comprehensive and digestible data. They're also the backbone behind the methane alert and response system that I mentioned before to help speed up the detection and attribution, and then communication to actual operators and regulators on the ground of where methane emissions are coming from to allow them to mitigate them more quickly. They also administer the OGMP 2.0 framework, which is its own community of practice. And so putting this data into action, but also just consolidating these various sources, so you have more of a one-stop shop for these remote sensing information, is a really valuable tool to help simplify the landscape. Another key partner is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is also housed within UNEP. They're able to provide a lot more in-depth engagement on some of the implementation, policy, and planning tools, including turning data into national inventories to guide methane strategies across sectors, developing and enforcing effective policies and regulations, and other opportunities to build capacity, especially within government landscapes. And then finally, the last key membership that I'll discuss today is the World Bank's Global Gas Flaring Reduction Partnership, which is able to do a lot of in-depth engagement with SOEs and regulators to improve methane emissions measurement, identify flare gas capture opportunities, and also address venting as well. I think that there is never any shortage of people that we need to work on climate action. But luckily, a lot of these same types of solutions can be very easily embedded into the, as we know, pretty robust employee bases for major oil and gas producers as well. If you're able to get oil out of the ground, you should be able to also measure and address methane emissions as part of that. Once these reduction opportunities become more regularly ingrained in company culture, and especially in regulatory contexts, that I think is the gap that needs to be filled. It's going to be a complicated question all the way down in terms of getting the right personnel at the right level with the right expertise. But these types of international tools that we have, as well as just the advancements in technology and measurement approaches, is going to be really helpful in leapfrogging that, especially in developing country contexts.
I guess thinking about more of a domestic focus, as I said, our office includes the Methane Mitigation Technologies Division, and that's doing research and development around methane quantification, methane detection, working on, some of the things that have been highlighted today around reconciling different types of measurement. And so it's a real, a commitment by the federal government to both sponsor that research, but part of the goal of working with folks like MDill and CSU and Colorado School of Mines is about developing the talent and expertise in the U.S. To understand those emissions. Hopefully, advancing that is building out the workforce of the future. And I guess it doesn't end with just the annual appropriations that Tim and his team deploy through funding opportunities. We also this summer announced collaboration between EPA and the National Energy Technologies Lab, where there's $1.5 billion in the IRA to look at methane mitigation, and that I think David Lyon referred to it earlier, but the first tranche of that funding has I guess the opportunity just closed, and so that's going out, but there'll be continued work in that space. And then internationally, just to highlight this, the framework and the work that we've been doing through this framework, there are a lot of countries that are participating, and not all of them have technical expertise to participate fully in all the discussions. And so much of what we're doing there is a bit of education and bringing some of our the importing and exporting countries together around some of these concepts and really trying to drive that sort of collaboration forward. And then I guess just the last specific thing to note, earlier this year, the U.S. and the European Commission announced collaboration on a research facility in Europe that CSU, the METEC group is, Dan and others are working with Tati to build out capacity for looking at emissions measurement in Europe. And so I think those kinds of bilateral engagements and multilateral engagements of trying to build out expertise around technology, share that expertise, and help build understanding globally. I guess those are all things that I've seen since I joined the federal government. And then I guess my last point on this is that I joined the federal government a year ago, and DOE, I guess EPA put in their plug earlier, DOE is also hiring, and we're looking for experts and looking for expertise. And so if you're interested in these topics and you want to be in the thick of things, come up to me. Tim Jarrett's here as well, and we'd welcome more expertise within the federal government.
I like all the healthy competition in the room and on that regard.
I also just want to say, before you pick clean every brain in this room, I believe we also have some job postings from MDill. No, I think what I'm hearing is there's no shortage of need for expertise, and maybe I'll just pivot. I think it's clear within a university context we're trying to build capacity through students and training and teaching and courses and continuing education and all of those things you would expect a university to participate in. So maybe I'll just speak for a moment from the perspective of having been administering the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership for the last couple of years at the interface with the companies, and a few things that I learned, one of which in retrospect, doesn't seem that surprising, but it felt like a learning to me. And so when we think about global capacity, assuredly in the United States, we are spoiled, frankly, with the access to the technology options. When one of the roles of the staff on the OGMP team, which is a really small team, is to provide effectively free consulting to the OGMP members. And so we do recruiting, we do report grading, we do all those types of things you'd expect, but then the rest of the time we're writing technical guidance documents and trying to help share information between companies and really lean into this idea of a partnership. And so we worked with a lot of companies and national oil companies, and what we'd hear from them the most is, hey, I don't mind paying for this, and I think it's a good thing to do, I just don't know how to do it. And so kind of a recognition that on a global basis, people are in very different places on their methane journey. And so what is maybe really cutting edge to us in this moment, because we've been playing with 17 technologies all at the same LNG compressor facility at exactly the same time and, doing Monte Carlo simulations on that data, there are other people that have never seen the results from an OGI camera. And so, there's an opportunity in that to say, we in a meeting yesterday, someone said hey, things that feel to you researchers like really old news because you get bored too easy, is still really relevant and timely for others. And so making sure that we remember, we too, 5 or 10 years ago, were making our first measurements, and helping to exchange that knowledge becomes really important, I think, on a global basis. And then the other thing, and the one that was surprising to me, more surprising than the dearth of technologies on a global basis, was how critical the role of the service providers is in scaling anything within oil and gas. So I can be, a little bit standoffish sometimes when people would call me over and over and say, help me with this OGMP thing, because I worked part-time for the UN, and we were a staff of 3 people for most of the time, and I was only part of a person, and we had 100 companies that we were helping. And so the idea of helping all of these different service providers and vendors build a practice about OGMP they were going to sell to others, to me was maybe a little twitchy. And I think what I learned is actually, there's no way I can field all these calls. There's no way I personally can just never sleep again. And it's going to mean that we need to find the people who have built an entire practice around knowledge transfer on a global basis and get them trained to do the work and to transfer the knowledge on a global basis. And so I think I came to really deeply appreciate the role of the service provider in bringing about global methane reductions in that.
I'm so glad you said that, Aaron. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. If somebody who's labored in the policy vineyards, talking to policymakers, the level of understanding of the technical stuff that many of you guys are familiar with is really very different, very variable, let's say. And I'm sure you go internationally, I hear all of you saying this. So another form of capacity is education and understanding. And I think that's so important. It's a big part of what EMDL is doing. And just to give you an example of this, I think a lot of people think if you have continuous emissions monitors, it's like, oh, well, you have a meter metering all the emissions. And as we know, clearly it doesn't work that way. So I think it's a really important point and an area where there's so much opportunity for collaboration. Dave, do we have more questions?
Sure, we have lots more questions. I'm going to call questions from the morning, and Aaron posed the question, what do you think the most commonly asked question for the EPA, David Lyon, would be? Well, what do you think the most common question for Tom and the DOE would be? And it is, what's the timetable for the MMRV technical framework?
Thanks. I should have anticipated that. So we're really, I said during my remarks that we are, that we're not at the beginning, but we're closer to the beginning than I think to the end. Our overall objective is to move as rapidly as we can this year, 2023, around getting consensus within the participants on the agenda and the work ahead. So those elements that I described, building out and fleshing out those elements in more detail, and then really setting out a work plan for 2024 and trying to advance the framework again as much as we can in 2024. So there's so that's our timeline, is really get agreement around the framework elements, again, more detail than what I described, and then to try to accelerate as quickly as possible on those next calendar year.
Great, thank you. Oh, Claire, I wonder if there's anything you want to add. Obviously, you're dealing with the upcoming COP and the COP after that and so on, but any particular timetables that we should be mindful of, other than we need to move at the speed of policy and international diplomacy, and not too slowly either?
Yeah, I feel like my timetable is always the clock to 2030, but absolutely, I think that we really cannot underestimate the window of opportunity we have at COP28 this year, which is just in 7 harrowingly short weeks. But there is so much global attention on how the oil and gas sector is going to cut emissions and align themselves with 1.5C. And I think across the board, there's recognition that methane has to be part of that solution. If we don't see industry stepping up to seriously bend the curve on methane, both in terms of their own corporate commitments, but also how we're going to address methane reductions in developing countries where there are these additional capacity building, access to capital needs that will require some funding to resolve. If we don't have a solid answer to that question, I think there's going to be a lot of challenges at COP. And to put that in a more positive light, I think this is really a place where robust action by industry, by governments, can and will be welcomed across the board, even as we grapple in parallel with more complicated questions around Scope 3 emissions and the future trajectory of fossil fuel use. And so I think it's critical that we really make the most of this moment where we call for the most ambitious actions possible to address methane emissions so that we are in a good trajectory to really bend the curve between now and 2030. And by the way, just picking up on the earlier conversation around new hires, we are also hiring. You probably won't be doing any Monte Carlo analysis for our team, but we are expanding our team of folks working on methane and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. I can't be there in person to chat more about it, but if you look on my LinkedIn, there's a post for the job description there. Thanks.
It's almost feeling like we need, rather than just envelope boxes for CVs or something here. This is great. Thank you. Dave.
So we've heard a lot already about data quality, and we'll hear more as we go through the rest of today. But can the panelists give us any thoughts on how we might initially think about these data quality indicators that need to be part of some framework, and how that gets used in the policy space and internationally?
Sure, I think that one's probably for me, but I'd really like to hear Aaron's thoughts on it as well. So conceptually, and I think, this runs through the discussion so far and the discussions that will continue to be had. There's, and Erin put on her slide, just the variety of different technologies and techniques that are used to measure emissions and understand emissions. We've also heard a lot about the uncertainty and the really the wide bands of uncertainty associated with particularly methane emissions. And so what we've been thinking about, again, this conceptually, thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of delivered gas, that there, as you think about how you put that together across the supply chain, it's not just what is the uncertainty associated with a particular equipment at a particular site, but it's aggregating that and putting that together across an entire supply chain. And so what we've been brainstorming and thinking about, and again would welcome input and thoughts from the entire community, is whether there's a way to express that. Express the data, express the uncertainty around the quality of the data. So is there a way to think about a data quality metric or a data quality indicator that can be thought of as providing the marketplace or providing users of the data with not just here's the greenhouse gas intensity, but I guess thinking about like a bond analogy, like this is AAA rated or this is CCC rated. And so then at the end of this aggregation process, you have, here's the carbon intensity and here's the, this is AAA rated, 0.2. This is CCC rated, but it's 0.1. And then the buyer of the gas, depending on the purpose, if you're thinking about different buyers might have different purposes or different uses for the data, and they may be willing to accept effectively a lower quality data quality in exchange for having that carbon intensity number, that greenhouse gas intensity number. So what rating corresponds to what uncertainty level, that's the hard work, but conceptually, that's how we've been thinking about it.
I can describe a couple of examples that we've seen, and I don't know that either of them are perfect, but in the spirit of kind of building from things that have been tried out. The two that I'm familiar with are the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership has levels of reporting. And now within each of those levels, you can have quite a significant variation in uncertainty because the OGMP is principles-based rather than rules-based, which leaves a tremendous amount of freedom of choice for the operator to decide how much to measure, how often to measure, what technologies to deploy, et cetera. But the concept to the levels was meant to imply some increased level of certainty in the result by saying at level 1, it's kind of the quality of a scope 3 measurement where you just kind of say, like, I don't know, like this is the portion of the industry I'm contributing to. At a level 2, you have sort of 5 categories at a like really generic international framework reporting level. At level 3, you have now at least inventoried all of your actual equipment and activities and have accounted for that. So you've dialed it in a little bit more, but you're still using generic means by which to estimate your emissions. And so that's kind of like a mid-grade, kind of the state of the art for generic emissions estimating anywhere. Moving to level 4 means that you have developed asset-specific emissions estimating methodologies that are ideally grounded in measurement wherever possible for your material emission sources. And I would come back to that word material in a moment. And then level 5 means you've used 2 independent views of your emissions to ensure that you are not exposed to some significant unknown that's just been left on the table because of your selection of technology. And so with each of those steps, qualitatively, you should be significantly increasing the certainty of the emissions that you're reporting. Now, can you put a number on that? No. And so if what the market of the future demands is some sort of quantitative uncertainty estimate, that doesn't meet that moment. But that's one qualitative representation of increasing certainty in some sort of level 1 through 5, and so 5 is better than 1 kind of manner. The MIQ grades, I think, are interesting because they put together the intensity and a certainty. So if you're an A grade, you have their lowest level of intensity, but also their highest level of assurance that that's correct. A grade B could mean that you have lower higher emission intensity, more emissions, with a really high certainty on that. Or it could mean maybe you have lower emissions, but you don't have the certainty on it. So they try and, like, the worst grade, it's a reflection that it could be worse, or at least you can't prove that it's better. And so that's kind of embedded. And there are a couple of different ways that that's been tested out to date. But what I think is really important for us to remember as we develop these types of metrics is that not every measurement brings with it equal value, and that not everything needs to be measured. There's not value in assuring to a certainty of 10% a 1% emission source. And so remembering that however you're going to aggregate some sort of data quality indicator, making sure that you're paying attention and aware of the largest sources as a focus to dial that in, I think is where the real value comes. Because if you're wrong about your 50% source by 100%, it matters a lot. If you're wrong 100% by your 1% source, it matters not at all. And so I think those are the examples we have to draw from, but I think we still have our work cut out for us.
I remember, Tom, you starting off with the point that there's not a consensus way to judge these claims. And I felt for a long time that it's hard. It's obviously hard for market to develop without that. Just thinking about the conversations this morning, and next we're going to have Ben Cahill, who's quite an expert in markets and so on natural gas markets. But I'm just interested in your thoughts on those early signs you're seeing that if we could develop that there actually is real interest and potential market. What are some of the signs you're seeing that, in addition to considering security, cost, and reliability, well, the stakeholders that you talk to, and maybe this is to Claire and Tom, that they really are concerned about this, and that if we can have these mechanisms, that we actually could see the development of markets. Claire, you want to start?
Tom, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, and Aaron as well.
Okay, I can start. So I'd say I guess there's a couple of things, and Claire may have more to say on these points, but just in the last couple of months, Japan and Korea announced this clean initiative, and so looking at methane emission, greenhouse gas emission measures that can be done in their LNG supply chain to reduce emissions, but with a aspiration of trying to move towards more quantitative understanding of those. And so I think that's a real signal in the international market that there's an interest first in understanding and getting reduced emissions associated with purchased LNG, but then also kind of moving towards or signaling an interest in better understanding quantification. Similarly, I mean, it's the throes of the European trilogue process around their regulations, and I think Ben's going to be talking about this later. But it'll be interesting to see where that lands. But they've definitely indicated an interest in understanding the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy that they're using, not just in the individual EU member states, but in their supply chains. And so I think that, so that's kind of globally, and I think within the U.S. in sort of my previous life as a consultant, I mean, working with power companies and utilities around understanding their Scope 3 emissions, and what is it what are the emissions associated with their purchased fuels, and there is a lot of uncertainty there, and there's an interest in that. Whether or not that, I guess, whether or not that results in some sort of premium or anything is sort of outside of what I'd want to speculate on. But the idea that there's an interest and that there's value in understanding those upstream emissions, I think is a theme that I've heard internationally and domestically.
Thank you. Claire, do you want anything you want to add?
Yeah, glad to. I think this is it's an evolving conversation, but one that's evolving quite rapidly in terms of where we're seeing policymakers step in on this, and hopefully where we're seeing additional voluntary commitments as well. The initiative that both Tom and I referenced that Japan and Korea launched, this clean initiative, was done with a pretty explicit intention of allowing major consumers of gas in Korea and Japan, starting with JERA and KOGAS, and hopefully expanding to others, to be able to differentially purchase LNG that has a lower methane emissions footprint, and being able to translate that into more direct price signals and incentives to cut methane emissions. Obviously, all of that has to happen on the foundation of robust, verifiable methane emissions data. And it also, it does require folks take that extra step to ensure that new contracts or existing contracts actually take methane emissions into account, and that it is a real price signal as opposed to just a rhetorical approach. I know that there's only been, in the current moment, a handful of specific transactions, I think, that are taking place on the basis of differentiated natural gas per se. But I do think this is an area that's going to be a much more prominent lever in terms of our methane mitigation toolkit, especially as we see the outcome of the EU regulations and also additional actions in the Pacific markets. But obviously, with both of those geographies, you're covering a lot of the largest gas importing geographies as well. And there's also a lot of new analysis coming out, I'm sure, by many of the folks in this room that's estimating the actual price impact on consumers of putting in things like a methane fee, for example, or a methane standard. And by and large, they are very modest, maybe like a 1% price impact on overall oil or gas prices as a result of putting in, say, a $20 a ton of CO2e price on methane. It's a very low-cost option for a very high emissions reductions outcome in providing a much more targeted signal in these areas. So I think that additional attention on this topic from the analytical community will be really helpful in encouraging greater ambition and action across the board.
Great. Thank you, Claire. I think we have maybe about 5 minutes left. Do we have one more question, Dave?
Yeah, I'd like to just offer the opportunity, despite this being primarily a globally facing panel, to offer both Claire and Tom the opportunity for them to comment on what we might expect looking across the U.S. federal government about coordinated activities across the many agencies that are taking initiatives around methane.
Sure. Claire, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot happening. I think that obviously on the domestic side, we have IRA implementation of the methane emissions waste charge, inventory methodology improvements, the methane emissions reduction program, and obviously our upstream oil and gas sector methane regulations coming out of DOE, out of EPA, which we're making very swift progress on, also in partnership with DOE. There's also implementation of a variety of billions of dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law that are being carried out in DOE, Interior, and others as well. And also rulemakings taking place in Department of Transportation and our Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to address methane emissions from downstream gas sources. And that's not even touching on the vast landscape of what's happening in a subnational space at the state level to leverage best technologies and practices there as well. And I think that I might defer to our domestic agencies to share the precise timelines and updates, but it just goes to show how we're really doing our part in the United States to mobilize all the opportunities we have to reduce our own methane emissions from the oil and gas sector and show a blueprint for this internationally. Pivoting more towards how the United States is supporting these outcomes internationally, in addition to the specific bilateral and diplomatic engagement we are having on a routine basis with major producing and major importing geographies, we're also working to scale the resourcing available for methane reduction across sectors. President Biden launched the Methane Finance Sprint at the Major Economies Forum this April, aiming to mobilize at least $200 million in public and philanthropic funding for methane reduction by COP28. And we expect to have a significant resources mobilized by COP28, both in terms of public contributions, but also private sector contributions, especially to address emissions in this key sector, and also working with our partners in EPA, DOE, elsewhere to support international engagement there as well. So being a little bit vague now, but definitely stay tuned between 7 and 9 weeks from now, and we'll hopefully be unveiling all of these in Dubai.
Tom?
I guess this is going to seem, I think, small compared to the list that Claire just went through. So again, I'm relatively new to the federal government, and one of the things that's incredibly dull and boring, but really does happen, is that there's an interagency review process for rules as they're going out. And so we at DOE are not writing the rules, EPA is writing the rules, but there is a process of interagency consultation, and that does happen. So I guess I just wanted to confirm that with everybody. And then a specific example. Well, and then I should also say, as a result of this MMRV work, there's a lot of interest within the federal government. We've been having Claire and I really have gotten to know each other through this process. So there's engagement with state, also engagement with EPA as we're moving forward with this framework to make sure that we have distinct lanes, but that there's an understanding of what's happening and how things are going. Again, EPA has a different has a mandate and has regulatory guidance that they have to follow, and EPA will continue to do that. But there's an interagency awareness of the work that we're doing with this framework and information shared between DOE and EPA. And then to kind of further highlight the collaboration, again, this was one of the points that Claire made, the methane emission reduction plan, or I don't know if I have the MERP, the acronym right. It's a bunch of money that was through the IRA, $1.5 billion, and really it's a lot of hard work by Tim and his team, Tim and Jared, to get the gears of government to work. And when there's the kind of direction that Claire just talked about, when there's interest from the leadership, the administration, from the top down, when there's interest from the top, then we all have to work hard to try to get things to move. And there was a lot of work done there, and I think it's been successful. There's information out on the street about that, and there's continued work to be done there. But it is possible, and we do coordinate across agencies to try to get things done.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Aaron, any final word?
This has been great.
It really has. I want to let's thank, this is a very broad landscape to cover, so I want to thank Claire, Tom, and Aaron